in search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix, and today we have a very special episode. It's an episode that we were not sure we were going to record, but given recent events, felt it was very important. So typically we try to set out a schedule, and we try to give you in-depth analysis on a variety of topics, but we want to try to continue to have more conversations with you all, and thus have conversations with each other. So for this episode, we're going to continue in a conversational format, something we're going to be trying out for the next couple of months to really break down important conversations. I think we want to continue to engage in conversations around important texts. One thing we're realizing is that engaging those texts in the manner of precision and depth that we want to takes time. So we want to be able to have those as a special treat. But be sure to use this platform in a way that provides you the information that you need and that we need you to have in order for folks to understand the things we do as an organization, the things that animate our perspectives, guide us, and we hope that you continue to support us as we continue to do our work at lbsbaltimore.com, but also continue to engage the ever-evolving Black Liberation Media. So please check out Black Liberation Media. I think they have exciting things coming out in the next couple of months, and obviously the next year coming up after that. But in this episode, we want to talk about the 2024 election. So for years, there's been conversation about a discrepancy between Black women's support for the Democratic Party and support amongst Black men. This was an issue in the 2020 election. I actually did an entire video presentation about that. You can check that out on the lbsbaltimore.com YouTube page. But in 2024, given how close the election is, given this is the opportunity to elect the first Black woman, this conversation is taking on added importance, with Barack Obama actually giving a talk a few weeks ago to quote the brothers, basically saying that they're seeing a differential in support where Black women support Kamala to the tune of about 90%, Black men support her to a tune of about 80%, and basically saying this is a reflection of some sort of sexism. Of course, 80% support for a Democratic candidate is by far the highest amount of support of any male demographic in the United States of America. And there was some backlash to Obama, the likes of which have not been seen recently in American politics. In addition to that, Kamala released her platform's opportunity agenda for Black men, which included, amongst other things, commitment to the federal legalization of cannabis. Given the conversations we've had about Black men, given the conversations we had about cannabis, it felt like that we originally kind of felt like the election's so close, not just in terms of Trump, Kamala, but in time for us to turn around the episode. We felt, given what was in the document, what was not in the document, people probably wanting to know what we thought about what was in the document, we wanted to have a conversation about it. When I say we, I mean I'm going to be joined again by my organizational partner, LBS Director of Public Policy, Davon Love, to have a conversation about Kamala Harris's opportunity agenda for Black men and cannabis legalization, the possibility of finally having federal acceptance of legal cannabis. How that's framed as a business opportunity for Black men, how the reality of that may not live up to the promise, how the agenda itself may reflect potentially more of a marketing pitch to Black men rather than an actual attempt to empower them, but going more in detail around the politics, around why some of the conversations about why these things were included in the Harris agenda and what it means for the Democratic Party's possibility of actually meeting the needs of not just Black men, but the entire Black community. So we thank you. Please continue to check us out at lbsbaltimore.com. Leads a Beautiful Struggle on all your socials. Check out Black Liberation Media. And continue to come with us in search of Black Power. So this is the conversation between myself, LBS Director of Research Lawrence Grand Prix, and LBS Director of Public Policy Davon Love on cannabis legalization and Kamala Harris's Black male opportunity agenda. See you on the other side.
So a lot of people who are familiar with the work of LBS, there are a variety of contexts where we've talked about our perspective on how to navigate the electoral arena with our perspective. We are notoriously critical of both political parties, particularly the Democratic Party, given the way that the work we do in Maryland is impacted by the Democratic Party stronghold that is Maryland. And so, as I mentioned, we've talked about this on a variety of platforms and, on Black Liberation Media, on Breakthrough News. I had a back and forth with Roland Martin about on his show, years ago. So, we've been pretty public and explicit. Actually did a panel yesterday with the Association of Black Social Workers, where we did a panel with them and had Nnamdi Lumumba from Ujima People's Party, Sister Afeni Evans, who currently is a organizer that's working with the Maryland Green Party, and Senator Joe Carter, who's a person who a lot of our legislative work, she's been a conduit for a lot of our legislative work. So our perspective on the electoral space from a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective is pretty well documented in a variety of places. We thought that it would be good to do a podcast episode in light of the current discourse around the courting of Black men electorally and the agenda that Vice President Kamala Harris has put out in an attempt to address the concerns that they feel like Black men are dealing with. So for me, I think this allows us a unique opportunity to talk about that as a way to deepen the conversations we've already had about how we imagine people should navigate the larger electoral arena. So yeah, I think it'd be good to just kind of chop it up about that. So yeah, what you think?
Yeah, I think that we talked about this in 2020. There was this discussion about the missing Black men. I did a whole presentation about that, basically talking about how Black men die and are not counted statistically in a lot of ways. So to sort of, even beyond the argument that you just assume any group of people has to vote for you 100%, this gender variance, ignores some of the realities of Black male life and almost pathologizes them from experiencing that suffering. And the idea is that, well, it's so much better than Republicans. They even do anything for you means you just got to vote Democrat. But when you actually look at the agenda, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but almost nothing in the agenda is explicitly only for Black men. This is a PDF document. It's not like a big presentation. It's literally just a text document. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah. That is all stuff she's already said. All stuff that is essentially universalist policy. But the argument she's making is that, well, this will disproportionately help Black men. And so I'm going to list the stuff that the Democratic Party essentially is already claiming to do, that they say will disproportionately help Black men. So that's things like prescription drugs. They talk about having a particular focus on health initiatives that impact Black men. A lot of talk about building new housing so that Black men can get access to cheaper housing. Crypto is famously in here, right, because Black men do have disproportionately large amounts of crypto assets. Still not a lot, given our economic situation. My brother's in the crypto. Both my brothers are in the crypto, actually. Community violence intervention is in here as well. Again, all things that they're already doing. But none of them is saying this is only for Black men. So they're trying to get the electoral benefit of claiming to have a specific agenda for Black men, but not allocating anything explicitly specifically for them. Now, part of that, which I imagine we'll talk about, is Supreme Court. It would be deemed unconstitutional. Some people say that shows she's smart. I would say the closest thing I saw in here that will almost certainly specifically benefit Black men is the pipelines for mentorship and teaching tied to HBCUs. Now, of course, a non-Black person can go to a HBCU, but they are highly, highly Black. But that's the only thing in here that is like, that's almost certainly going to go straight to Black men. Everything else is just a reframing, not only of what they're doing for Black men, but also an attack on Trump. Yeah. Trump calling Black men thugs. Trump talking about the Central Park 5. So this is a public relations strategy at the point of time, we're here in mid-October '04, where most regular people are just starting to really pay attention to the election.
Mm-hmm.
So she's been getting hammered and hammered, what you doing for black men, what you doing for black men. Last few weeks of the campaign, she drops this PDF document. And I really think it's a recapitulation of stuff we've been saying for a while, that they want to give you the maximum amount of public relations and appearance to mobilize the base, but not actually promise anything that would alienate the large swaths of white voters, particularly suburban college-educated voters, who would stand to benefit from a lot of these programs that are tied to the nonprofit industrial complex, which is where a lot of those folks work.
Yeah, and I'm gonna pick up on that last point, because one of the things, that you mentioned that we've talked about for a while is the way that black people in the Democratic Party are a captured electorate.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing unprecedented levels from mainstream polling of dissatisfaction with both political parties, right? And so there's a lot of conversation about where do people go who are tired of the existing duopoly. And when you talk about black men, one of the things that has emerged over the past few years is more discourse around the particular kinds of violence that happens to black men in particular. Because I think there's a way when you talk about, particularly black men and boys, mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, and community violence, we see that in many respects, some of the biggest targets, perpetrators, and victims of it are black men, right? So I think there's an increasing acknowledgement of some of the particular societal vulnerabilities of black men and boys, whether it's the emergence of black male studies and just other scholarly endeavors to investigate that. So I think a part of then what we're seeing in some ways is an extension of the same, like you mentioned, the same playbook, which is that instead of dealing with some of the fundamental issues that create the level of violence and oppression that black men and boys face, that again, it's the kind of PR. But I also want to take it a step further as well. Because, and to your point around not wanting to alienate your liberal, suburban, middle-class voter, white voter, right? In some ways, multicultural even.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a way that when we talk about the image and narratives of black men is inherently violent and criminal, it is extremely hard to overstate the extent to which, in the American collective consciousness, that is seared into our mind as a society in terms of how people interact with black men. And even though the Republicans are more vigorous in pushing those narratives and representations, it is my sense that those liberal, multicultural, more elite, middle-class folks also share those beliefs. But they also understand that there's a base within the Democratic Party who's impacted by it. So to be explicit about the fact that they share those same beliefs about black men would alienate a base of black folks they need, which is why we get such a, as you described it, a kind of PR policy piece. And I want to talk about one particular area of policy that we've talked about a bunch given our work here in Maryland that I think speaks to this. So one of the things we're seeing around the country, and it's no secret to folks that follow our work, that we've been in pretty consistent battle with Sinclair Broadcasting that owns, TV stations both here in Maryland and around the United States. And in many of those same places, we're seeing a resurgence on policies around mandatory sentencing, more interaction with law enforcement, mandatory detention. Particularly when you talk about the expansion of the criminalization of gun possession, right? Just mere gun possession. And one of the kind of general notions that I think is a overarching societal cultural mythology is the belief that most black men are potential drug dealers, right? So you think about the drug dealer trope. You think about the fact that for many working class and poor black men and boys in communities like Baltimore cities around the country, for a lot of folks, biggest access to economic opportunity is drug trafficking. And not that we condone it, right? We don't want people selling, poison to our community, right? We don't want people doing things that's harmful to our community. But we understand that people are making a rational choice. And if you're engaged in that activity, well, you can't call the police if someone robs you, if someone shorts you, someone doesn't do right by you business-wise. So it is a industry where it requires one to take matters into their own hands in terms of enforcement. And what has happened is that structural reality of that environment has been altered in a way where that is made an essential characteristic of the people that do it. So if you're a drug dealer, you're a person that is just inherently prone to violence. That's what you want for your life. What we know is people who know people who've been engaged in that activity. These are people that wouldn't want to do that if they didn't have to, if they felt like they had other viable options. But society has created, the combination of respectability politics and just the way that these notions and narratives and stigmas have been projected on the black men. What the position that I just laid out is a position that in some quarters, particularly those elite, suburban, liberal environments, would not be receptive to. Because the reality is that they're scared of those black folks because of those societal notions. They don't want to actually engage them and think about what they need. And so when you think about some of those policies around the extended criminalization of gun possession, if you know that other people have a gun, you know that people will carry one to protect themselves. To me, that not being a centerpiece of the discourse and conversation when you're talking about dealing with the concerns of black men, to me demonstrates a lack of a genuine desire to really look at what are the things that animate the conditions that black men are living under. So for me, the very absence of that, both conversationally and in the vice president's policy agenda that you read off, like to me, it shows like, oh, this is the same playbook that the Democratic Party does with black people in general. And again, having absent something that is so central, particularly to working class and poor black men and boys, to have that discourse absent, I think is a demonstration of the same kind of games, the symbolic, superficial things that the Democratic Party does for our community, and not substantive things that actually would transform the community.
So I think that's a really good point, Davon. One thing that is one of the reasons I felt we had to do this essentially emergency podcast is that the commitment to creating a path to have legal cannabis being the law of the land is in her policy agenda. Now, what she's claiming is that we're going to keep the economic benefits of cannabis legalization for black men who've been disproportionately impacted by cannabis incarceration. Now, we know the reality in almost every state where this is rolled out is that the amount of capital flooding into the cannabis space means that's not a reality. That if you were a justice involved or person doing street economics, you don't have hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, at least not of clean money that you can invest in the cannabis business. And this is important. One of the biggest things that people have been saying for years with cannabis economics is the worst thing that would happen to the possibility for working class black folks benefiting economically from cannabis would be for it to be legal nationwide. Because when you have legal cannabis nationwide, that means you can do interstate commerce. Right now, when you have weed in Maryland, it has to be grown in Maryland because it's federally illegal. That violates interstate commerce clause. If it were legal nationwide, all of the people who are doing small-scale grows, craft cannabis in every state, they would be flooded by cheap Cali weed. And they would essentially wipe out all the gains that have been made at the state level for any of the small-scale entrepreneurs that have been doing this work. But it's such a good talking point. I'm going to finally legalize weed. Mm-hmm. Most people don't know the details to know it would do almost certainly the exact opposite of what Kamala claims to want to do. Mm-hmm. It would not empower poor working class black folks. It would destroy the sliver of working class or middle class black folks that have gotten any benefit from statewide cannabis legalization in these states.
And just to add to it, and you'll probably get to it, both in terms of the amount of investment it would take to make the people who were selling it illegally, the amount of resources and infrastructure it would take for them to benefit from it will require a level of investment that none of the states that have legalized it have prioritized. And I think in terms of the interstate commerce piece that I think makes it, that amplifies the point you're making, is that some of those same folks wouldn't be able to compete with those national corporations that would take over the market. And to your point, like to not raise that, to not have a plan to address that, demonstrates a lack of sincerity in that regard.
Yeah, because all she wants is to say, well, I'll legalize it, Trump won't. And I think, to your point previously, it almost normalizes and naturalizes the trope that people want to be drug dealers. We know a lot of folks, different game. They don't want to sell legal cannabis. They even want to do some other business or maybe run a nonprofit. So locking in cannabis sales as a racial equity mechanism, as opposed to like what we did and focus on redistributing the tax revenue in a manner that has community control, that is now nowhere on her agenda, I think is very telling. Because I would say the only vision of cannabis equity I'd want to see is essentially have it be decriminalized at a federal level, have some sort of federal taxation on it, and use that money from federal taxation to do reparations for the war on drugs at a scale that would actually intervene in the trillions of dollars that have been stolen from these communities in asset forfeiture, and the combined impacts of stealing folks from their homes and locking them up for decades. You need to target the places with the most arrests for investments controlled at a city level in the communities impacted by the war on drugs. That is nowhere on there, I think, is a recognition that to do that would mean that the suburban multicultural folks that are the Democratic base, they would not control that money. That would no longer be a jobs program for the professional managerial class, which is mostly the Democratic agenda at this point. So that's where you really begin to see they want the image that mobilizes the middle class, poor, black urban base. But when the actual economic benefits of the so-called black male agenda go down, whether it's the health equity program or the other investments that most likely be controlled by large nonprofit organizations, not run by or staffed by the people who are impacted by these things, the black men.
And I think one of the best things I would say probably the best thing on this agenda is the piece around black men championing black men, whether it's in education, mentorship, and training programs to become teachers. In a lot of those kind of human service environments, there is a shortage of black men in those fields. So I think that's probably the best thing that's on here. The thing that I would be interested in, though, as you mentioned, that professional managerial class that essentially all that industry is a jobs program for, I would be interested to see like how militant would a president, Kamala Harris, be as it relates to forcing those industries that in many respects are part of the Democratic Party base, to force them to essentially seize those jobs away from a majority white women dominated space and to actually give that to black men. And I would go as far as to say that this is one of those things that if Kamala Harris were to actually champion that would probably be the most threatening thing on here to that very network. I'm just quite honestly doubtful that there would be a political risk that she would take in that regard.
Do you think so, even given the fact that a lot of those mentoring programs can veer towards respectability? Like, given that the assumption is black men are deviant, and a lot of white people, it's like, if you're telling me you're going to take that potential sug and make them a citizen, you can go do that. So there's like this tinge of anti-blackness that can even be projected into the mentoring space. That's like, just deal with them, just make them not crazy.
Yeah, and that's helpful because for me, and I want to be very specific, I'm talking particularly about the part around teachers. You know what I mean? Like, I think,
I agree.
One of the things that LBS did, that we worked on is around like African Center Rites of Passage, right? So our perspective on the kind of character building that young men in our community need is rooted and steeped in traditional African culture and, much of the stuff that we've talked about in a variety of other contexts. So I think that teacher part, that social worker part, like those are the industries where black men are least present. And because of the fact that those industries tend to be jobs programs for white folks with their kind of missionary desire to fix our community, that's the place that would actually be the most disruptive to an important constituency of the Democratic Party. I have a theory about this cryptocurrency piece real quick, and we probably won't talk about this long, but it's interesting that it's on here as a part of the agenda for black men. it's my I haven't seen the data myself, but it's my understanding based on some of the things I've listened to that black men have a disproportionate investment participation in cryptocurrency. And this is a place where I remember back in 2020, a group of sisters approached me that were in the kind of Movement for Black Lives Network. And they reached out to me and a few other men, people like Phil Agnew, people like Tef Poe, folks like John Taylor out of Atlanta, a variety of folks, Asa Shaw, variety of folks who, we came together, and it served as the creation of, shout out Rich Wallace from Chicago was there too, to the foundational creation of Black Men Build. And it was what they came to us and said, it's looking like Trump is going to be able to get 20% of black men to vote for them, to vote for Trump. And that they recognized that even within some movement spaces, that there wasn't enough intentionality around bringing black men to this space. So that's in some ways its own conversation, but I bring it up in the conversation about cryptocurrency because I think there is a impulse amongst black men that I think is understood as a desire for access to patriarchal white supremacist masculinity. And I think that in some ways, I don't blame a person for reaching that conclusion. Because I think one of the things I've seen in like the so-called manosphere, right? You'll see a lot of black men talk about like, we got to stop being so emotional and be logical and rational. And we got to engage politics, not from an emotional space. I was at the barbershop the other day and they had a brother on who is a self-described black conservative who used this same talking point of we can't do politics from emotion. The Democratic Party, they appeal to emotion. The Republicans deal to logic, right? So it makes sense to me if you listen to some of that for a person to draw the conclusion that that it is about that tendency, that impulse is around black men's desire for access to white patriarchal masculinity and power. What I think, though, is that when you think about the assault on notions of black masculinity, right, from patriarchal society, and this takes us back to the ancestor Francis Cress Welsing, who talks about the, white folks' anxieties around black phallic potential and genetic annihilation, right? And that the castration and obsession with black men's genitalia and lynching is kind of a psychosocial evidence of her argument about the fear around that. So there's a particular violence to black masculinity and a denigration of it. And that what I think black men are looking for is looking for an affirmation of masculinity and power in ways that won't get us destroyed by the larger system, right? Because when you see, again, one of the things that the ancestor Dr. Francis Cress Welsing talked about is when a young person sees King got assassinated, Malcolm X got assassinated, Medgar Evers got assassinated, that we need a form of black manhood and power that doesn't get us destroyed by the system. So I see black men who get into cryptocurrency, this is their alternative, right, to occupying that kind of black manhood and masculinity. So when I look at this cryptocurrency piece, to me, this in some ways is capitulating to a very Republican, conservative, capitalist version of the impulse that I'm describing. In some ways, I'm surprised that it's here. Because I think when you think about much of, particularly progressives, but just like liberals in general, I'm surprised that it's here in some respects, because to me, it's like, if cryptocurrency is something that's specifically attributed to black men, then essentially you're capitulating to the impulse where there's some black men that think, oh, Donald Trump is good because he's a businessman, right? Like you're capitulating to the very tropes, but that the Democratic Party is attacking. So to me, it's just kind of strange that in some ways this feeds that narrative that I think the Democratic Party would be in their own interest to push back
I think
against.
it's interest convergence. The amount of crypto money that has been pumped into this election is intense. So part of what I think is happening is Kamala is from California. She is part of the Silicon Valley set. So by claiming to regulate crypto, they are normalizing crypto and allowing it to become more central in Democratic funding spaces. Sam Bankman-Fried was throwing money around before he got indicted. But they can't just do that. They have to somehow add element of like, we're going to try to regulate it. We're going to like make it a racial justice thing. So you can't do no scams. So we're going to make sure the brothers don't get scammed as they hustle. You know what I mean? So I do think a lot of this reads as interest convergence, particularly the housing stuff. Really, I think is concerning because there's this constant focus not on price controls through rent controls or price controls through co-ops, but price control just through building more. And as this, Roland is rapacious on this point. There's a lack of housing. You build more housing, supply and demand, the price goes down.
Roland Martin.
Yes, Roland Martin. So the thing about the supply and demand argument on housing is that when you build housing, you take out a loan. That loan has an interest rate. Interest rates are high. So you have to make profit that allows you to pay back the bank. And what's the most profitable housing to build? It's not affordable housing. It is upscale housing. So when you talk about new housing being built, almost all of it is geared towards trying to get the higher income people to use it because that's what's profitable. So just building housing, not only does it not decrease the price of housing, it may actually increase it, because if people see apartments in Baltimore, the new ones that are going for like $1,800, $1,600, you may have an apartment at $900 that's like, let me check it up to $1,000, because the market has been reset by all this new luxury stuff. That's what other cities are seeing. And so I think that it is incredibly demonstrative that this intense need of a commodified human right, which is shelter, we got to do something, but the only thing we can do is what the market will allow us to do, which is build more housing, but essentially at market rate, and no focus on challenging capital, no focus on black folks being exploited by these systems and, all this other stuff. It's literally just, well, you pay for housing, we'll build more of it, that's going to be better for you, right? And it's this very, superficial engagement. But that's most of what you get in a YouTube video, in a 5-minute session on Hot 97 when they talk about politics. It's enough. And so they're going to do enough to get the PR and to really launder what is a very neoliberal capitalist agenda through the frame of serving black men's needs.
And one thing to add on to that, again, both tying that and kind of what I was saying about the cryptocurrency piece being included here, is that when you think about some of the advocacy on economic justice historically, like one of the things that we have talked a bunch about is the importance of the community control of public resources. So you look at the work of Perrin Mitchell and Walter Carter and the Community Action Agency here in Baltimore in the 60s and 70s, where it was a uniquely resident-led community action agency that was able to get resources to the neighborhood, to communities. Or you think about Perrin Mitchell's work around the minority set-asides, right, with the intention. Now, the way that it's been operationalized over the past few years is different, but its intention was to provide more access to public dollars to black folks in business to build a stronger economic base as a site to be able to do more redistribution of resources, right? And so I think that when we think about the Democratic Party agenda, to your point, like instead of framing the economic agenda as an explicit agenda around redistribution of resources to our community, that it is more access to the kind of neoliberal entrepreneurship, business opportunities that's not about building more infrastructure in our community and redistribution resources to working class black people. But in many respects, this is the kind of agenda that will most benefit middle class or middle class aspirant black folks who are individually trying to do better, but doesn't build the infrastructure for our community to be able to be better positioned. Yeah, I think in terms of another piece around the conversation around black men, at least a couple more things that I'm thinking about. One is the And we didn't talk about this in depth, in terms of our preparation, but just it's coming to mind Barack Obama and his comments in terms of, how black men should vote and his appeal to black men. And, there's been a bunch of conversation about how a lot of people were insulted, in terms of his commentary. To me, I wasn't insulted because I expect that from Barack Obama. But one of the things that, for me, I think is important to talk about is that as a people, we know, at this point at least, that black faces in high places doesn't translate into benefits for our community. And that in some respects, it can actually make it so that the larger community gets less. And I think for a lot of folks, the Obama administration was evidence of that. So you have people who, now you're seeing Kamala Harris, and you're seeing Kamala Harris, and what you're seeing is people who remember the Obama years saying, this is the same thing they said last time. And instead of having to actually engage that conversation, I think that Barack Obama's commentary was a way of sidestepping that fundamental question. Because I can't imagine that there wasn't a brother in that room who thought to themselves, yeah, I remember, I probably did vote for you back in 08. Davon did, right? But their brothers were probably like, yeah, I voted for you in 2008 and 2012, and I don't feel great about it, right? But instead of actually having to engage it, right? And so I think on this, this conversation around black men and the conversation about us voting and participating and voting for Kamala Harris, I find it frustrating that in a lot of those mainstream places where that conversation is being had, where that isn't directly being engaged. Like there isn't a direct conversation about the fact that for black men, it's like, we know what happened last time and you want us to do this again, right? And to me, this agenda, again, is a way of sidestepping that very question. Like address the fact that a black person held this seat before and it translated very little to the larger community, and that black men who are feeling that way have a right to pose that question. It's almost as if that question, like folks who pose that question don't have a right to pose it.
It's interesting because when Kamala was asked about this on the Breakfast Club, about black men and voting, she was like, please turn out, don't let them take your votes away, don't let them take your power away. And I was like, you can just say something specific you're going to do that's going to be useful. That's right. And she tries to do that with this document. Almost all of it is just general stuff that would help us more than given how down bad we are. And like, we know we're down bad. And we'll take benefits from stuff when we're down bad. But what are you doing specifically to meet people's needs? Like, they're talking about building housing and not talking about how they're going to have black people build that housing. Mm-hmm. Which is anathema, not just to the work of Parent Mitchell, but to, the folks in Detroit who were like, look, 68 riots, we're going to rebuild our communities. It was your racism that caused us to burn it down. We're going to build it back up. Like that long tradition of we need to rebuild our communities and we need the resource to do it is just absent. Mm-hmm. And I think it's to the point where I think this has a lot to do with the FBA ADOS stuff. Because it's like, how do you not get it? You must not understand. You must not really be black. Because any black person would understand you got to actually do something. You can't just be there. You got to do something. Mm-hmm. And it's like, they're so disenchanted. It's easier for them to believe, well, it must be because their parents didn't grow up here and weren't born on this soil, than it is like, no, they're just bought and sold. They are corporate Democrats. Mm-hmm. They're stewed in the world of Pelosi and Clinton, which demand certain rhetorical concessions to black people, also rhetorical attacks on black people. Mm-hmm. That room Obama was in was full of Democratic Party advocates. Mm-hmm. He was talking to no one in that room. He did that on camera specifically for that clip to go viral. Mm-hmm. And I don't quite know who he's doing it for. Mm-hmm. I think he's doing it for some people that's like, we got to keep them black men in line. Somebody got to smack them around and show some discipline. Mm-hmm. And that it's like this political culture that demands black folks in general be disciplined performatively, as well as politically, in a way that, again, drives people. It's like, why would you do that? It must be because your daddy wasn't born here. It's like, no, it's like that is the political culture in which all of them are stewed in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, in terms of these are corporate Democrats, and we know we get with corporate Democrats, mainstream liberal corporate Democrats. The other thing, and you mentioned this earlier, the state of the Supreme Court, the fact that using race explicitly is more tenuous when it comes to advancing policy that specifically deals with a particular group. And, you think about Ed Bloom and the Fearless Fund and the way that the assault on that, the assault on the reparations work in Evanston, where they've, filed an injunction against them because it's exclusive to Black people. And which to me, if you're trying to get Black men, that is a fight to emphasize, right? And to be more affirmative about. Because I think to your point, like, and we've both written and talked about the limitations of FBA and ADOS and all of that. And if folks are serious about the fact that Black people need more economic relief, then being 10 toes down on a strategy to make it so that there are policies that can explicitly impact Black people, Black men, like Black women, like that is something that should be a point of emphasis. And again, it's one of those things that is surprising because there's a neoliberal version, right, that we've seen, or affirmative. There's a neoliberal version. We talk about affirmative action, access to college campuses. Like there's a neoliberal version that in some ways is counter to the politics that, we espouse and we've talked about. But there's also a radical version that I think would be palatable to the masses of Black people, particularly Black men. And I just think that it is one, a missed opportunity. I guess it's hard to call it a missed opportunity given the nature of what the Democratic Party is. But I would say this, I think that when it comes to the importance of delivering on policy, and there's a strategy put out to deal with Black men, I think we're at a point now where Black men are asking the question of, okay, what specifically are you going to do for Black people and Black men? And I think that, again, there was an opportunity, I think, to say that when it comes to fighting back against the Supreme Court and fighting back against these rulings that complicate the ability to talk explicitly about certain kinds of policies that are targeted towards people. And we've heard the vice president talk about universalist policies as the primary approach to dealing with this. And I think this set of policies leaves her and the Democrats susceptible to this criticism that they're most willing, maybe almost exclusively willing in terms of substantive policy, to do universalist policies and not policies that are targeted towards Black people in general and Black men in particular.
They're kind of in the worst of both worlds right now because the people who are pro-universalist policies are mad at her for even using a racialized frame to talk about these policies, and they're mad that there's a Black male health outreach. It's like, well, why don't you just do universal health care? Right. So they're not assuaging that base, and they're also not assuaging many of the working class Black folks they want to turn out. I think the way I read it is research has shown, and this is just me, purely the pragmatic case for her, people perceive female candidates as more liberal than they are and Black candidates as more liberal than they are. So Kamala is trying to walk this line where she is trying to appease a white electorate. 70% of a presidential electorate is white in this country still. So just 1 or 2 points on the white vote outweighs an increase in working class Black male turnout, which is very unpredictable and may not be situated in swing cities besides Philadelphia and Milwaukee, right? So she's like, I know them suburbanites vote. I'm going to present stuff for Black people, but nothing that's going to make them too mad. And I'm going to give the fodder to at least compete with poor working class Black folks in terms of turnout while not flipping some more wishy-washy suburbanites on me. Because even though a lot of those suburbanites are switching from Trump to the Democrats, the fact that Biden was an old white guy, some people say helped with that. and her being a lesser known black female, she's scared. And I think that's the thing, is like Democrats, especially black Democrats, are conditioned to be afraid. So why don't we fight the lawsuit? Because they're afraid. And they also swim in professional environments where it's like, someone should do that, fight that lawsuit, but not me. Because I am going to be looked at in my dinner parties like, what are you doing? Like, don't you realize you're going to lose the election because of that? It looks like you only care about black people, you know? So I think it's just this persistent socialization around what is politically expedient from a bunch of perpetual losers. Right. You know, like, I say it all the time, the Democrats lost presidential election after presidential election. I think they lost 4 out of 5. So it's Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush won. So they won 1 out of those. And the lesson they took from that was the left destroyed them. Association with the left is what lost them all those elections. And these people are old, so they were, not only do they remember that stuff, that was their formative political socialization, was getting beat by the Republicans. And to the end, to their dying breath, they will not tack left. They will not assuage special interest, because in their mind, that's how you lose elections. So this political mantra has been beaten into the heads of every Democrat for generations, and this agenda is the living embodiment of what that produces.
So one of the things that might be good to round out on this is that to talk about like just the electoral landscape more broadly, and to talk about like our approach to navigating the electoral context in ways that's different than the discourse that we get. I think that the overarching discourse when it comes to elections is the Republican-Democrat horse race. It is the binary choice. And one of the things that I think that the media is most guilty of is creating a political discourse and culture where people have a very two-dimensional understanding of what it is that is happening when you vote. Because it all comes down to Trump or Kamala Harris. And a part of, for me, why that's, and I think that a lot of the skepticism which I think led to the specific attempts to address black men is the dissatisfaction that people have with that binary choice, right? Now, what we know, again, what we've talked about for many years is that, in fact, we think voting is one of the many tools that are important in terms of addressing the concerns of our community, and that voting is more complex and should be dealt with more strategically than thinking just about Democrat, Republican at the top of the ticket. So one of the things that we've always said is we encourage people to vote even if you don't vote for who's president. Like if you leave that blank, there are a bunch of other things on the ballot that you can vote for that are important both locally and nationally. But one of the things that I want to focus on is that when we think about, as we kind of mentioned at the top, black people being a captured electorate of the Democratic Party. And being a captured electorate, there should be things that we do to address the fact that we're a captured electorate so that we have more leverage to get things, to deliver on things policy-wise for our community in ways that being a captured electorate doesn't allow us to do. The fact that there was even a need to court black men, to have a black male agenda, demonstrates the fact that the party has not delivered on policy for black men in the United States. And to the point that you made, this isn't a FBA thing. This isn't like this isn't a, they're not native born black people or they're immigrant, the descendants of immigrants. So that like that, these are corporate Democrats, right? For whom what they want is they want to maintain are thinking about the election in terms of just those binary choices. And so one of the things that we've said in the past, for instance, we're in Maryland, presidential cycles, it overwhelmingly goes Democrat. I, very publicly and notoriously, I don't vote for Democrats for president. And I know that it doesn't impact the Electoral College. And it is my belief that the work that many people in Maryland have done to fight against the duopoly has led to a political environment that has moved the legislature and the political environment further in the direction of the kinds of policies that would actually impact Black people. So when we think about our work on reparations, community-based violence prevention, some of our work around challenging mandatory minimums, legalization of recreational cannabis, all the stuff around juvenile justice, we think that the fight against the duopoly here in Maryland has helped in the work that we've done on policies to deliver to working class Black people in ways that the Democratic Party would not do on their own. And so I think that a part of the response, like this black male agenda from the vice president, to me is evidence that the duopoly framework, people are dissatisfied with it. And so my hope is that people's reaction to this platform isn't, and I think some people will try to make this case, oh, see, the Democrats respond. They responded to a base that voiced that it wasn't being delivered to in terms of actual, concrete benefits. To me, what the lesson in it for me is that we need to keep being skeptical and questioning. And again, not the FBA ADOS thing of questioning whether she's Black or not. She's a Black woman, right? So whatever, like that is a useless conversation. But to continue to be critical of Kamala Harris as a corporate Democrat, and that if we don't put pressure that requires some of us to politically navigate outside of the limitations of the Democratic Party, then there would be no pressure for the vice president and her campaign to be president to even feel like that they had to put out something in order to appease our folks. So my hope is the lesson is this is what happens when you don't just fall in line. And while, as we've talked about, this isn't a super substantive set of policies, but it demonstrates the fact that they now know that there's pressure for them to do more than they otherwise would have done.
Yeah, and we were talking about doing a whole episode on third-party politics. This, kind of came up. I do think there is a strategic component and just like a fundamental component. So strategically, the argument that Democrats make is those people who say I'm not doing enough, they don't vote anyway. But if you show up and vote and just not vote for them, leave the top of the ticket blank or vote green, that shows them that you do vote, that you're just not voting for them. And that puts a different type of pressure on them because they see that. They know you are a voter, but you're just not voting for them. So part of the idea of, like, for in this case, voting Green Party has ballot access. They can push things like the Green New Deal, which was co-opted by the Democrats and influence climate legislation. These things push the political environment in very meaningful ways. So I think it's one thing where they just constantly say you're just throwing your vote away, they're not going to win, there's no point. Well, it creates the political landscape within which a Democratic Party is forced to operate. And if you don't demonstrate your disaffection, they're going to assume they can get away with giving you the bare minimum, right? And I do just think there is a strategic component to, like, foreign policy pressure. Like, this platform has nothing about any connection to any foreign policy entity. Not Africa, not Gaza, not nothing. And just the historical linkages between, not just the Black radical tradition, but even like the hip hop community, PLO style, Wu-Tang Clan, like seeing what's happening in Gaza and just expecting universal Black people support, I think is an insult to the moral intelligence of Black people. And I think it's one of those questions where there is a component where if you feel like you're not going to get anything from politics anyway, putting your name on someone that does that type of violence is hard, and so there's a component where it's like, my name is my name and you don't get access to my credibility. So you do something crazy and people say in the barbershop, is that your man? Is that your woman? You voted for her? It's like, no, I didn't vote for her. And at the end of the day, that's real. And people, make a decision about your political expediency, what you think is effective, and whether you can put your name on something. And I think those are the type of questions that are very real and complicated the Democratic Party does not want to grapple with meaningfully, because they would have to grapple with the concessions that they've made to capital, to empire, in the name of trying to keep power. We hope you have enjoyed this emergency episode of In Search of Black Power. Please continue to check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. There you can sign up to be a sustainer. Small monthly donation, recurring, allows us to continue to produce these podcasts and do forms of political work. Again, we're not a nonprofit, so we're able to directly intervene and engage some of these political dynamics in a way some organizations cannot. There you'll find more episodes of our podcast, the back catalog. We have a variety of written pieces coming out. And please continue to support Black Liberation Media as we continue as a collective to go on our media journey. And check in on the work we're doing here at In Search of Black Power. This podcast is going to be whatever it needs to be for us to continue to provide the information that we need to provide. So we're going to have a lot more conversations on things like violence prevention. We're hoping to have an election recap episode. So when the returns are actually done, the last episode potentially of the year, maybe in late November. We may not have the results actually in mid-November. But we're going to try potentially do our election recap episode. Similar if you were able to catch what I did in 2020, potentially looking at some of the turnout demographics and evaluating some of the narratives and comparing it to some of the evidence. But next year, we're looking to continue to have some more of these dialogues, some more of these collaborative conversations between myself and Davon. We're going to try to potentially bring in other contributors and probably have some more of those long-form, deep dive episodes. But the amount of time it takes to produce those really is something that is not something we can always allocate given the variety of other things we're working on professionally. There's a possibility that some of those more narrative, long-form, sound effect, interrogation, review type episodes could be a perk to those who give us money every month and sign to be sustainers. So that's something that we are thinking about potentially adding as well. If that appeals to you, please contact us. You can contact me directly at lawrence@lbsbaltimore.com. Again, lawrence@lbsbaltimore.com. And look forward to hopefully seeing you before the new year. But if not, we'll see you in 2025 and going forward as we continue to go in search of Black Power. See you soon.